love to introduce my co-presenter here, Ned Johnson, president and tutor geek of Prep Matters, celebrated author of many fine books, including What Do You Say and The Self-Driven Child, and personally, the finest test prep tutor I've ever met, and I've met a lot of them.
Well, thank you and good night. It's been wonderful to be with you on that note. And of course, the fabulous Dr. Aaron Golumsky, our education director here at Prep Matters, who was the only person who has ever given me a run for my money and just how many hours he'll commit on a yearly basis, being in the trenches with students, helping to prepare for and battle that whole alphabet of standardized tests. But of course, the one we're going to talk about tonight is the PSAT, and a little bit by extension, the SAT. We have a talk planned in January, Aaron and I'll be back to talk about the ins and outs of the ACT versus the SAT. But tonight, we're going to deconstruct, hopefully bear in the backyard maybe, the PSAT.
Wonderful. So let's dive in. So before we dive into the 10 particular questions you need to understand, I was hoping that we could talk a little more generally about using these results as feedback. I see far too many students who have the tendency to take that PSAT score report, look at it and say, oh my goodness, that didn't work out, crumble it into a ball, throw it in the trash can. Right? And then I see other students who, casually look at their scores and then say to their friends, gee, is a 1430 any good? Right, don't be that guy either, okay? But really, this is a process. This was a practice test, right? I don't care how well you did or how poorly you did on the PSAT, you are exactly 0% closer or farther to getting into the college of your dreams. There's no mechanism by which you can transmit PSAT scores to colleges, even if you wished for it. So really, what we're here for is the feedback. And students who are here love that because you've already, dropped 3 hours into this PSAT. Makes sense for you to spend a little more time to make sure you're extracting as much value from that as possible. Right. So here, I like to say that when it comes to the scores, the how is more important than the what, right? More important than what are your scores, how did they actually turn out to be that way? So big picture things you might want to ask yourself, right? Did you set yourself up for success that day, right? Was it a good week? Did you get some sleep? Did you take it seriously? Was the guy next to you distracting you the whole test? I don't know, but these are really important things to think about, right? And as you go through the questions, and it's lovely because really, when you think about it, the PSAT, pretty much the only standardized test where you actually get everything back, right? You get the questions, you get the answers, you get, in many cases, your test booklet so you can see the work that you've done. So it's a really unique opportunity for you to dive in and really, in a kind of a question by question way, try to understand, hey, how did I fall short here? What did I miss? Was it, honestly, something that I literally didn't know how to do? Was it a content issue? On the other hand, did I kind of know what to do, but maybe I didn't execute it as well as I should have? Could I have approached it in a different way? Or finally,
and I was going to say, quick piece of advice there. A lot of times the school counselors will by default share those test booklets with kids or mail them home to families, but not always. So if your kid comes home with scores, but nothing more, direct them back to the school counselor to pick up that test booklet, because that, as Aaron is pointing out, is probably the single best source of information, much more useful than just the scores themselves.
Absolutely. And then the final reason that I love when I'm working with students, and I know Ned does as well, when we're looking back over the work and the student's like, I have no idea how I missed that question. It doesn't make any sense to me. And in our experience, that usually is kind of the effects of stress and anxiety and, oh my God, how did I miss that? What was I thinking, right? So I usually tend to put that into the we don't know what happened bucket. Instead, we put it into the, maybe you were tweaking a little bit. Maybe you weren't as calm and collected as you should have been. So kind of doing that question by question inventory can be really helpful in guiding what you need to do to improve. If, for example, none of your mistakes were content mistakes, then you probably don't need to spend much time reviewing content, do you? So really, try to extract every bit of value you can from those detailed scores.
Really good point. And just a real quick note on that anxiety. Kids will often look over the test and sort of apply hand to forehead and say, how could I possibly have missed that? There must have been such a stupid mistake. It really stings when a parent says that, how could you have missed that? How could you make such a stupid mistake? those things we should point out really are accusations with a question mark thrown out at the end. If you really want to get to the bottom of that, we want to do that with a very different energy, because ultimately you want your kids to embrace your help, not to run away from your help. And if you got a kid who's really charged up about this, who's feeling a little down about the scores, or even is just perfectionistic about that, you really want to tread lightly because you know your kids, you're well educated yourself, you want to be helpful, but be mindful that these scores, as little as they matter in the grand scheme of the process of applying to college, can carry a lot of emotional weight because everyone's sort of talking about them all at once. And so just tread really lightly, because kids can feel really stung by how they may have done on the test, and certainly by the questions that we're asking if they're done in a way that feel kind of accusatory.
And while you're talking to the parents, Ned, here's a slide for the parents, because the students have already taken the PSAT and they know what it looks like. For the parents in the audience who maybe aren't as familiar with the ins and outs of this test, here it is. Starts out with a 60-minute reading section, which, oh my goodness, is kind of like a punch in the mouth. If you've ever sat down and done it, I have. Follow that up with some writing and language, AKA grammar, and then a pair of math sections, right? When you add all of this up, gosh, that's, I don't know, somewhere around 3 hours of a test. That's a long time to sit and focus. So no matter what you take out of this talk, and no matter what your SAT preparation looks like, whether you go buy a book for Barnes and Nobles, or log on to Khan Academy, or join a class, or hire a tutor, whatever you do, please, 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 if you're taking this seriously, take some full-length practice tests. Many critics might say that, gosh, this test is far too long, and I would probably agree with them. But I just don't know of any other way to practice taking 3.5-hour tests other than, I don't know, taking 3.5-hour tests. So make sure you build that into your prep however you choose to do so. The scoring, as someone actually chatted a question about already, is kind of like the SAT, but a little different. The SAT has the familiar 400 to 1600 scale. The PSAT, and from here on out, we're talking about the PSAT 10-11, right? There's a PSAT 10 and a PSA 8-9. There are lots of them, but this PSAT that the sophomores and juniors took, 320 to 1520. A question already hit the chat as to how do I translate my PSAT scores to SAT scores? Well, honestly, for the most part, you just treat them as the same, right? If you're not in an outlying score, if you're sitting there with a 900 or 1,000 or a 1,200 or a 1,300, yeah, that's pretty much what you would have gotten on the SAT. If you're high enough that you need to worry about the difference between a 1520 and a 1600, you're okay, right? So don't stress about it. The test scores that you might see if you log into the website, they break out the reading, the math, and the writing and language separately. Of course, the reading and writing just kind of add together and tack on a 0 to get the overall very pithily named evidence-based reading and writing score. All right, so those are the scores, that's the section. And of course, everybody's million-dollar question. So, Ned, what's a good score?
Well, that's a great question. And a great score is a score that supports you, is helpful for you in applying to school that you want to go to, that's a good match for you. Everything else is color commentary and a lot of drama and probably not so helpful energy. And there was a quick question in the chat. Aaron, what we're deconstructing tonight is the PSAT the kids took in various dates in October. So that's really designed as the PSAT for 11th graders, though 10th graders also take it. The PSAT 10 that is given in spring of this year is slightly different and not what we'll be talking. This PSAT 9-10, not what we're doing now, not what we're doing tonight.
Yeah, great point, Ned. And also just to shout out, there was a Wednesday PSAT and a Saturday PSAT. We'll be talking about the Wednesday PSAT because that's the one that's actually publicly released. If you took a Saturday PSAT, that's great. The results are wonderful. Unfortunately, they're never going to show you that test again. So we just can't get our hands on those questions. So we'll be talking about the tests that we actually do see. So I totally agree with Ned's answer to that good score question, right? These are admissions tests, viewing them through any other lens besides admissions is unhealthy at best. That being said, it is an admissions test and you do want to know where you stand. So here's just a quick show of PSAT percentiles. And I've broken this out by sophomores or juniors because tis the season for sophomores to call us in a tizzy saying, oh my goodness, look at these PSAT scores. This will not do. And by sophomores, I mean their parents. Yeah, I'd like you to take note of these percentiles. And if you look from sophomore year to junior year, you can pretty much add 100 points. So keep that context with you, right? Why is there a 100-point benefit? And by the way, most sophomores not doing a heck of a lot of prep before their junior PSAT. So this is not because everyone went out and bought books and studied. I would say this is for two reasons. One, you learned more math, right? And two, oh, I don't know, you're a year older. And this test, this long 3-hour slog, doing well here is as much about staying cool, making good decisions, and keeping your composure over the course of a 3-hour test as it is about knowing when to use a semicolon and what the equation of a circle is, right? And those are all your executive function skills. Those are your prefrontal cortex. And that whole prefrontal cortex of a teenager is, a year in teenager years is kind of a lot of development there. So that's why, at least in my estimation, we see that score creep. So here you can kind of contextualize yourself in terms of percentiles. So you get a sense of where you fall relative to the test-taking population at large. So with that context, let's actually dive in and look at some gory details, shall we? First, we're going to just take this in order. We're going to look at the reading section, everybody's favorite section. And by everybody's favorite section, I mean almost nobody's. I do love it though. So why can this be difficult for students? First of all, it's long, right? Like we said, this is an hour long on the SAT, by the way, that creeps up to 65 minutes. For those of you who don't know, the biggest differences between the SAT and the PSAT, about 10 questions in 10 minutes, right? Really, it's very similar test. The content's the same, the format's the same, just a touch longer, just a few more questions. But by and large, the PSAT and the SAT, in terms of content and questions, interchangeable. You could give me 10 questions from a PSAT and 10 questions from an SAT. I would be very, very hard pressed to tell you which is which, right? So it can be a difficult test. Also in that it's an incredibly literal test, right? This does not feel like English class. We are not putting a work in its historical context and reading between the lines and thinking about what the author may have meant and how his experiences shaped the language he's using. And those are all wonderful things to think about, by the way. They're great for English class. Every single one of them will get you in trouble on this test. Students just aren't used to the close analytical reading that this test demands of students. Right. So what are we going to do about that? Well, if you are a sophomore, my bullet point 1 here is cultivate a broad and frequent reading habit ASAP. Really, when we get the overachievers who call us in 9th grade and 8th grade, heaven forfend, and say, hey, can we start SAT prep? We send them away and say, no, please go read books. Really, it is without a doubt the best thing you can do for your SAT scores. And by the way, it's kind of the best thing you can do for your long-term education, which might even be more important.
Quick question for there, and because certainly we get parents who are inclined to think that, gosh, yeah, let's have our kid. Let me grab a bunch of books and throw them at my kids, and the kids can be inclined to throw them right back. If parents are trying to find a middle ground and help their kids engage in reading. Thoughts on that? How to get kids doing a bit more reading if they're not exactly inclined to sit down and read, War and Peace or some other, really quick title.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, in my experience, the kids who are readers generally have parents who are readers, right? If the after dinner habit in the house is to open a book, when the after dinner habit in the house is to open a book, not turn on the television, right?
Do they have those on Netflix? Sorry. So do they have those on Netflix?
The books, yes.
Yeah, right.
But and that may seem that boats left the harbor, but I don't think it's ever too late to kind of create a new healthy pattern in that way. Also, we certainly, I talk to kids all the time. I recommend books all the time. More than happy if you're interested in tell me what your kid's into, to try to find a book or two that I think might be appealing, because really, that they're reading is way more important than what they're reading.
Agreed. Well said. And for a lot of kids, shorter form things of, magazines that spark an interest, because, great writers are going to be found in writing about everything, whether it's, culture or cars. It may not all be literature and current events. And to your point, all reading is good reading. Some may be more valuable, but goodness knows, reading something that it sparks a kid's interest is going to foster more of that. And as you mentioned before, the reading comprehension, the SAT is no longer just populated by fiction. It's a ton of nonfiction, which is awfully important for kids to be reading that beyond what they're reading in their English classes.
Yeah, for sure. So now I'm going to apologize for the parents, because we're going to dive into very particular questions from the PSAT, and I'm going to discuss them as if you've, I don't know, done a PSAT. So, for the kids in the group who've actually done this, great. This is where you're going to get a lot of benefit. The parents will get a good sense of the type of thinking that is really required of your students as they negotiate the PSAT, even if you don't understand like the particular contexts. So for those of you who have a PSAT in front of you or are online and have the College Board website open, just a note on question numbers here so you can follow along at home. Reading questions 7 and 8. These are questions 7 and 8 on actually the online portal. If you log into your account on College Board, this will be questions 7 and 8. This may not actually be questions 7 and 8 in a test booklet if you have it in front of you. Why? Because they actually spin these things. There are a bunch of different copies of the booklet where questions are interchanged and question numbers change and the passage order changes to, obviously curtail any sorts of cheating and looking over at the neighbor's paper that might be going on. So impossible for us to know exactly which reading question this is if you have a hard copy in front of you, but these are definitely questions 7 and 8 if you happen to be playing along with the online tool open in front of you. So I said that this was going to be 10 questions. I snuck in an extra one. They're actually going to be 11. Why? Because this is a pair of questions. These evidence questions are tremendously important on the PSAT and the SAT. They ask you one question. In this case, it can be reasonably inferred from the passage that Sudha views her parents' problems in London as having been. And then the very next question is, hey, which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? You can expect 2 of these pairs on each of the 5 passages on the SAT. What does that mean? That means 20 questions of the more or less 50 questions on the section. That is basically 40% of the reading test are these evidence pairs. So started out with that because it's incredibly important to have a good sound strategy to deal with them, because they're, 40% of the test. So here's the strategy that we espouse. And again, we're going to get in the weeds here, but enjoy. So first of all, like I said, we're going to treat them as one question. We're going to do them at the same time. First thing you do, obviously, read the question stem, right? We've done that. Number 2, however, is not to look at the answers. Number 2 is to probably go to the line references. Unless you have a superhuman memory, you're probably not going to remember where exactly in the passage Sudha's view of her parents' problems in London might have been mentioned. So you have help. Use the lines you're given. After you've used the lines, then consult the answer choices to see if anything matches up. Right. So in this question, how does that work? Well, let's look at lines 35 through 40. You want to ask yourself, hey, do these lines have anything to do with the question prompt? Right. Here, we're talking about some baby pictures of Sudha, a lovely white lace dress, but I don't particularly see any mention of how she might view her parents' problems or her problems in London at all. So we're just going to cross out that answer because it can't be right, because it really doesn't speak to the prompt. Moving on, next set. Here we do have problems, right? Here we have her parents who were discriminated against in London in the 60s and whites only signs, and her parents were Indian and pregnant, so it limited their options. That sounds like a problem in London, I would think. So let's look and see if there's an answer choice that goes with that. Oh, hey, Answer choice A, a somewhat unfortunate but common occurrence from that time period. That seems pretty reasonable. I would say that's unfortunate and likely common. Great, so we're going to tick mark that, and we're going to say, aha, B and A kind of go together. But we're not going to jump. We're not going to make that answer because our job is to find the best answer, and it is nigh impossible to find the best answer until you first look at all of them. So moving on, we have the next set of lines, which also mentions some problems. We have an episode out of a Greek myth or Bible, blessing and portent, marking her family as survivors, a strange intolerant sea, very metaphorical, but also somewhat problematical. And in fact, this should look really good to you because look at the question that was asked. It wasn't really about the problems, it was about Sudda's view of the parents' problems. Oh, well, this all of a sudden speaks way more directly to that question stem than the last pair that we almost jumped on. So we're going to mark that a potentially fraught situation with an appealingly dramatic conclusion. The dramatic conclusion, of course, being that they survived, fraught with situation, blessing and portent. So some language there, by the way, some vocabulary, but that's a pretty good match. Finally, we'll look at the last answer, which talks about, a lovely little anecdote from school, but doesn't really talk about problems. So at the end of the day, we now know that answer choices D and C are the pair that go together and best address the question stem. Yes, you might be saying to yourself, gosh, that sounds really tedious, Aaron. Yes, it is. I would go so far as to say that if you don't feel that this process is tedious, you're probably not doing it right.
And it's one thing we'll talk about when we hopefully join you, or you join us in January, talk about the SAT versus the ACT. The ACT is a lot more speeded, and people think, well, gosh, I want all that extra time in the SAT. It must make it so much easier. There's a reason they give you more time per question on the reading on the SAT. It's not that it's hard to do, but it can take a lot more time to do.
Moving on, next question is reading question 10. It's a main idea question. It's the first question in a passage, and very, very often the SAT will do this. First question, hey, what's the main purpose of the passage? What's the main idea of the passage? In this question, what's the overall structure of the passage? So expect a lot of those questions, but I think what this one illustrates even more importantly is a nice strategy that I want you guys to be using. That is, I actually don't want you looking for right answers. Seems odd. I want you looking for wrong answers. Your first trip through the answer choices should be all about finding flaws and taking out the trash. We want you to stay kind of analytically engaged rather than creatively engaged. And in my experience, when students are saying to themselves, what's the right answer? What's the right answer? They're going to make up reasons why all of the answers are right answers. And I do not want students to be creatively engaged here. I find that typically it's easier for them to stay logical and very rational when they're saying, are there any flaws here? That's what we want to be looking for. And those flaws are often extreme words or overly specific words that don't quite apply correctly. And really, if any part of an answer choice is wrong, the whole thing is wrong. Right? So here, had you the benefit of reading this fabulous research study about infants tracking faces, it's lovely, you would know that after reading answer choice A here, that all seems pretty good. It's hard for me to find an answer choice or a word in there that doesn't quite match up perfectly. But again, I'm not going to jump. I'm going to look at the next answer because I didn't prove it's right. I just said that I'm going to keep it for future reference. On the next passage, we got plenty of things that are wrong. Skepticism about an area of research, that's kind of not what happened in this passage, so we can cross it out. In fact, every other answer choice, overview of a field of study, no, overview of an experiment, maybe, field of study, just a little bit off. Reveals complications, no, actually that subsequent study solved the complications. So again, it's taking things in the passage and twisting them ever so slightly so they're not exactly right. The words might seem familiar, but they're just used in the wrong way. When we see that, got to get rid of it. And again, controversial hypothesis, there was really no controversial hypothesis at all. There was a hypothesis, it was an experiment, it just wasn't controversial. So we can get these right answers by really eliminating the wrong answers rather than kind of trying to work too hard to find what's right.
And a lot of the students who sort of go off the rails a bit with reading comp on the SAT suffer from being frankly too open-minded, which is a wonderful trait to have in the real world, but on the SAT is not the one that we're most rewarded for. When I have students say, well, if you think about it this way, I will simply respond, if you find yourself saying, if you think about it this way, please stop thinking that way. These people are much, much, much more literal than they are literary. So don't act like this is your high school English class and go deep in reading between the lines, as Aaron mentioned before. Really try to be, kind of more like, people at the DMV. Well, technically, sir, that's kind of the mindset that's rewarded more on the SAT.
Yes, yes. The right answers will speak for themselves. They do not need your help.
Well said.
So moving onward, the last reading question I want to talk about is actually here in question 36 from a much later passage. And what I want to point out here is that this is not a main idea question. In fact, this question starts with the words "in the passage," right? In fact, questions that begin in the passage or according to the author or based on the passage, these honestly are kind of detail-y questions, right? If you kind of remember 3 slides back, I had a little caricature down in the corner. One was a Where's Waldo and one was a Sherlock Holmes, right? The first question that we talked about was definitely a Sherlock Holmes question, right? We were looking for all the clues. We were following the trail of breadcrumbs. Sometimes, honestly, it's not that hard. Sometimes it's just Where's Waldo. Right. So in this case, when they ask these based on the passage according to the author, detailed questions, for the most part, you're not going to need to do much paraphrasing or summarizing like we were doing before. They're not giving you a line reference. They're not telling you where to look. So the hard part is kind of finding it. So what you want to do is look for a word or phrase in the question itself that will let you know, oh, hey, what am I looking for? In this case, in the passage, a contrast Smith makes between senators and other Americans is that senators, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to focus on that senators and other Americans and scan the passage looking for something to do with that. And of course, it's going to be there, right? Literally in the text, American who is not a senator. Right. It is incredibly, incredibly literal, these questions, right? So we don't have to summarize. We don't have to paraphrase. Here, an American who is not a senator, conduct or motive unworthy of becoming an American, legal redress, stopped on grounds of being out of order. All of this points us really, really clearly to one answer choice, right? Have a means of defending themselves from accusations that other Americans lack. It is directly, completely in the passage. The hard part here is finding it. Right. So as you're reading, feel free to underline things from time to time. Feel free to mark up the passage. And it's not that we're not like writing an English paper here. You're not like finding pull quotes for your paper. You're really just kind of jogging your memory. You're creating a map, really. You're creating some road signs that say, oh, yeah, it was before I underlined this thing, but after that. It's just allowing you to find things in the passage a little more quickly and effectively. And anything you can do to make that process more efficient will probably help on this test. So that's the reading section. Again, Ned and I could talk for an hour on just the reading section, but we're trying to give you a broad sense of the strategies that will be helpful across all aspects of this test. So let's move on to the second section of the PSAT, the writing and language section, as it's called, which is basically an overgrown grammar test, let's be honest. So why is that hard? Well, honestly, to steal one of Ned's lines, apologies, boss. Most schools, most schools aren't very good at teaching grammar, and that's not because they're bad at it. It's just because they don't teach it at all, right? I love asking students, well, when's the last time you actually received an instruction on when to use a semicolon or a comma? And gosh, what kind of answers do we get? Like 7th.
Yeah, I mean, my experience, this is all thrown at kids in 7th grade. They go, and they take a quiz on it, and then they quickly, default to what they've always been doing and kind of forget all about it. And the good news when we think about grammar, but at punctuation especially, is it's wildly rule driven. It's just that most students write, once they get into high school, their English classes are much more interested in literary analysis and deep thinking and rich and rewarding conversations. Kind of being an old school pedantic grammar nerd is not where most English teachers are today. And so most students, therefore, it's just a little fuzzy. Well, I put a comma whenever there's a pause, which might be, de facto the case, but it's certainly not de jure where we want to be, which means that there's a huge opportunity when kids actually understand the rules of grammar and punctuation. It's a wonderful opportunity for them to improve their scores considerably.
Yeah, and if any of you have been, I don't know, anywhere near a newspaper lately, you've seen some people taking shots at these tests, right? These are not good tests. These are not fair tests, and fairtest.org, in fact, might say they're not fair tests. But really, if you're going to level some criticisms at the SAT, I can do that as well. We can agree they're bad tests if you'd like, but if they have one saving grace, it's that they're consistently bad. They're bad in the same way the time, and anybody who spent any time with them can at least admit that much. And that, by the way, is why prep works. And no section is that more clear than this writing and language section. It really, really is the same, I don't know, 2 handfuls of grammar and punctuation rules tested every single test, tested and test out. This is the section you can really drill and kill. I always love it when a student comes in front of me day one and the writing section is the lowest. Oh, that's a gift, because we know we can just make that a slam dunk. So let's look at some details as to how we do that. So here, parents might be able to play along a little more effectively, since this doesn't require you actually having read a passage. Everything we need to see right here on the page. So slightly confusing, writing question 3. If you're following along online, this actually pictures from a book I had, a test booklet I had where it was question 14. Apologies for the confusion, but online, if you click question 3, you will find this exact text come up. It's just marked in a slightly different way. So this is about this sentence. Oysters will often respond to these sounds by shutting their shell casings or valves. This is a clear indication that they feel vulnerable or stressed. So looking at the answer choices, we can see that this seems to be a punctuation question. I see options with no punctuation, with commas, with semicolons. What's the difference? What's the difference? What are the rules? Well, when it comes to punctuation, it's hard to think about what the punctuation is if you can't think about what the sentence structure is. So, when I start my review of grammar with students, we just have to start structurally. What is an independent clause? What is a dependent clause? How can we hook independent clauses together and dependent clauses together? The test just loves this stuff, right? And it is the bedrock from which all of the other grammar rules spring. We have to be able to identify sentence fragments and run-on sentences and full sentences and subjects and verbs, non-negotiable, right? So once we know that and can identify those structures, this then just becomes applying a rule. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to worry about what sounds good or not. We just have to apply the rule, right? The first part of this sentence, oysters will often respond to those sounds by shutting their shell casings or valves. That's a full sentence. But the part after, this is a clear indication that they feel vulnerable or stressed. That's also a full sentence. Are we allowed to hook those together with a comma, Ned?
No. We are not allowed to do that because that is a comma spice and it makes people very fussy, particularly tutors, especially English teachers who care about these things.
Yes. So we can't do that. We also can't just, I don't know, run those 2 sentences together with nothing. C actually happens to be the right answer. But wait, Aaron, I thought you said you couldn't use a comma. Oh, but look, what's underlined? It's actually valves, comma, this is. So this right answer choice makes valves, comma, and then changes the second part to simply a clear indication that they feel vulnerable or stressed, which is no longer a full sentence. Aren't they tricky? So got to read closely, got to see what's underlined, and got to see how these replacements work. But again, super black and white, super literal, very, very rule-based.
For the punctuation, much like a lot of the math that Aaron will get to in a moment, we often talk about it's sort of like a process of looking at game tape, right? And if you review the errors that you've made, it's perfectly fine to make mistakes because they reveal something to us about the test or about the test maker. It's simply that having made that insight to either of content or process, we want to do our best not to repeat it. And as you mentioned before, maybe bad, but consistently bad. And if we can learn from those rules, then up and up and up we go in terms of our performance on these tests.
To the moon, I believe.
Infinity and beyond.
Yes, and beyond. So not every question, by the way, seems quite as black and white, right? There are questions that they call conventions of standard English, which very, very much are just this. There's also something they call production of language. These are the questions that actually have directions. If there are directions, please, please, please read them. I know if you're sitting there as a high school student, you've gotten really good at not reading the directions, right? And I don't blame you, right? You get like 3 through 37 odd for math homework every night. They're all the same, and you don't need to read the directions, right? This is a test. You need to read the directions really carefully, please. That applies on all the sections. So when there are directions here, we read them. Which choice provides the most effective transition from the previous paragraph? And I've included this question because A, lots of transition questions, and B, teaches another really valuable lesson. That is, you have to read this whole passage. I know you just read like 5 passages for the reading section, and you would love to bounce from, I don't know, one underlined portion to the next without having to read what's in between. That would be a mistake, right? How do I know what provides the most effective transition from one previous paragraph to the next? Well, I don't know. I have to have read the previous paragraph. I also have to read a little bit into the next paragraph, because until I can contrast those and find the difference, it's really impossible to find the right answer. So when you're doing this writing section, hey, there's a reading passage on the left-hand side of the page. Start by reading it. Read the whole thing, at least to the end of the sentence that your question is asking about. Answer your question, pick up reading exactly where you left off. Because if you do read this, it's pretty easy to see the implied contrast between the 2 highlighted points here, and find the right answer. Again, the details aren't necessarily important here. The main idea is the process of making sure we're reading things, because plenty of words here that aren't underlined are still going to be critical to get the right answers.
And I always say to students, Aaron, as I'm sure many of us do, that once they've gotten down the rules of punctuation and grammar and really know those things backwards and forwards, almost all the mistakes the kids make tend to be really reading comprehension, which again, they thought they left behind in section 1. Some of the kind of trickiest, if you will, reading questions that exist are honestly in this writing section, which I suppose is why College Board describes the entire reading right as the evidence-based reading and writing section. We never really leave reading behind.
Yes. And one last short and sweet writing question before we move on to the math. Again, simple question here about a verb. Right, and we can see that our answer choices are different verb tenses or different verb agreements. So somewhat paradoxically, if the question is about a verb, your job is to find the subject, right? In fact, not just the subject, but the one-word subject, the simple subject. And this is where the SAT just loves playing games with people, right? So Young's assertion that the technical aspects of filmmaking should not interfere with the cinematographer's artistic aims for the story and its characters stem not from a disregard for practical considerations, but rather from mastery of them. Lovely 5-line sentence, right? Again, not all students are prepared to cope with that length of sentence, but really, what's going on? What's the subject? What's the verb? Plenty of students apply their ears and say, oh, it's characters stem. That sounds good. I'm going to say no change. That, however, would be the wrong move, because as we know, that whole long bit between the subject and the verb that technically, I guess it's a relative phrase introduced by the relative pronoun that. Yeah, that's all extra stuff. That's not the subject, right? So we can pretty much cancel all that out. Who or what stems not from a disregard? Actually, the assertion stems not. So again, this is a classic like SAT gotcha grammar question, right? And exactly the reason we tell students that they can't use their ear exclusively on this test. On to the math. As an inveterate math dork myself, I admit to enjoying this section quite a bit. Why can it be difficult? One, I don't know, the questions here just don't feel like math in school. We hear that all the time from students. Wow, this just doesn't seem or feel like my math class. And there's a good reason for that, because it's kind of not designed for the same purpose, right? Whether you students have chosen to think about it or not, someone worked really hard writing that math textbook that you hate. Right? Really, really hard. And they wrote all those questions and they sequenced them in a really particularly clever way so that, I don't know, you learn something by answering the questions, right? The point of math in school is to kind of teach you math. The point of these questions, oh, they're not to teach you anything. If anything, they're to mess with you a little bit. They're to make you think outside the box. They're to kind of get you a little uncomfortable. So it feels very different from school because it's designed to feel very different from school. That's a challenge, as is the fact that these questions are drawn from pretty much every math class you've taken in high school. There's Algebra 1, there's Algebra 2, there's a little geometry, they're going to sneak in a little pre-calculus on you. So it's not difficult because any one question is so unimaginably hard and deep. It's difficult because it's a broad test. It's a final exam for 4 years of high school math, all at the same time. So what can we do? We can, do the work. We can put in the reps. We can make sure we've reviewed the right concepts, and we can be really, really careful about reading. And I know I'm talking about the math section, but as Ned can attest as well, I don't know what fraction of math mistakes are generally reading mistakes, Ned, for most students.
Half.
Yeah, like literally half. That's where my head went, half as well, yeah. Right? And especially that probably gets a higher fraction for higher scores, right? The higher your math score is, the more likely that you have made a reading error and not a math error on this test. So how does that work? Let's take a look at a few details. First question here is from section 3, the no calculator section. And let me stop and talk for, I guess, just a second about that. Lots of students freak out when they see that, oh my goodness, the no calculator section. Please don't worry. They're not testing you on like long division and 2-column multiplication. That's not the plan. Really, if they were being a little more honest, they'd probably call it not so much the calculator section, but the algebra section. Right? They're just trying to make you have to do the algebra by taking away a tool that you have. So that being said, question 2, not a hard question at all. What is an equation of the graph shown? I say it's not a hard question, but you, student sitting in the seat, might be saying, what are you talking about, Aaron? That seems weird. That's an exponential function. I just started talking about that in my pre-calculus class. That seems pretty advanced. And yes, it might. In fact, you might not have ever seen an equation that looks like that at all, especially if you're a sophomore. But really, what actually do you need to know to answer this question? Well, to tell you the truth, not much. What's the y-intercept of this function? Pretty easy to look at the graph and say, I don't know, looks like it's 6. So that means the point 0.06 is on the graph. And as we know, if a point is on the graph, the coordinates of the point satisfy the equation. Hey, we can just test the answers. When x is 0, y should be 6. That's pretty easy. Let me put x equals 0 into each one of those answers, and oh, look, there's only one that tells me 6. B has to be the right answer. And I got that by applying something I learned about graphs that, I don't know, maybe you learned it in 8th grade for the first time. Really? A shocking amount of SAT math can actually be done using your 8th grade tools if you're just not intimidated by what the questions look and feel like.
And a lot of what people talk about is quote unquote tricks on the SAT are really about that comfort, that fluid ability to really think about what tool to apply where. And the more advanced kids get in their math curricula, the more likely they are to want to apply the most advanced tools they have. And exactly to your point, Aaron, we can take 8th grade tools. Sometimes we can take 4th grade tools, and use simple math to do simple math tools to do sophisticated math problems. And if we go back to where you started before, at the very beginning about when kids are anxious and executive functions, problem solving, emotional and mental flexibility, those are things that are really benefit us on the test. And so when you can walk with your child back through this test and see that there's more than one way to do this, that they got it wrong, not because it was overwhelming math and, oh my gosh, I forgot how to do the hardest stuff, but to really pause and think, in any given situation, there's more than one way to go about this. Aaron, I love your phrase when you talk with kids, rather than having kids get stuck in, how should I do this? How should I do this? Which really creates perceptual narrowing, to step back and ask ourselves, how can I do this? And in this case, exactly as you said, well, let's just plug in 0 for x and see what the y-intercept is and see what chance choices meet that. And turns out very little math needs to be done, even though the problem looks like it's asking so much more of us.
Lovely. So let's turn to a problem that actually is asking a little bit of us. section 3, question number 13, a classic problem, and that is it is a system of equations, right? 2 equations, 2 unknowns. Gonna see this all day long on the SAT. You've seen this all day long in your Algebra 2 class. So a solution to the given system of equations, x, y, what is the value of x minus y? Well, the SAT test writers know that students have seen these systems of equations before, and they also know how students tend to solve them, right? Back when you learned this stuff in Algebra 2, your teacher gave you a bunch of tools to solve systems of equations. One was called substitution, one was called elimination. And, you know, I don't know, for me, 90% of the students out there tend to be more comfortable with substitution. That is, I look at the question and I want to solve for x. So I use the second equation to eliminate y. Y is just 5 minus x. So I can pop that 5 minus x in for y. Oh, hey, that's 5 minus x squared. I know how to do that. I'm going to expand that. And then I'm going to dutifully distribute everything and get a quadratic equation. And then it's not going to factor, and I'm going to get stuck. Wait, maybe I've done something wrong. I'm not sure. Is there an easy way to do it? Of course, there's an easier way to do it, because the SAT just loves questions that have the kind of long, arduous, brute force way, and then the clever, oh, I've seen the elegant mathematical solution here. Yes, you can call it a trick if you like. I like to think of it as actually just elegant math, right? It's not a trick, it's actually math, right? So the thing we want to notice here is x squared minus y squared. That rings a bell. I've seen that before. I think my teacher called that the difference of squares formula that I can immediately factor as x plus y and x minus y. By the way, if you know, kids out there, if you see difference of squares on the test, yeah, that's the move. Please do it like every time. You know, oh look, x plus y, x minus y, but x plus y is 5. So 5 times x minus y is 100. Oh gosh, x minus y is simply 20, and I'm done, right? Didn't need to find x. Is a really ugly number if you do. Didn't need to find y, also a really ugly number if you do, but we can very elegantly find the solution here. This is common on the test, and there are tells, right? You know, by the way, whenever they ask you to find x minus y or x plus 2y or x times y, it is almost always to elegantly directly solve for that combination of variables rather than doing the brunt work. And again, as Ned has mentioned, right, when kids are stressed, right, they're not necessarily going after that higher order stuff. They're like, oh, turn the crank, I know how to do this. And they dive into kind of the hardest thing possible, right? So it really behooves students to stop, look at the big picture, see what they recognize, and can they work smarter rather than harder? Moving on to a question that's actually really easy, really easy. I didn't pick this one because it was hard. It's actually a super easy question. I'm sure students sitting out there, you've gotten it right. But I picked it because it's emblematic of content, right? By far the most common PSAT or SAT math content, it's linear equations. We see this in many manifestations all over the test. You're going to be graphing linear functions. You're going to need to know about slopes and intercepts. You're going to be solving linear systems and even linear inequalities. You're going to be creating and interpreting linear models and word problems with cabs that have fees to pick up a fare and then drive so many miles with some kind of fixed cost and variable cost. Lots and lots of different ways we're going to see these linear systems. This is just one example. So really, if you're sitting out there as an algebra student, right, linear models is kind of where it's at. Get really comfortable with it. You're going to see it over and over and over again on like every SAT ever. Here, pretty simple one. We're really asked to shift this line 6 units down and find what the function is. Well, shifting a line downward changes a couple things, like, I don't know, the y-intercept and some of the points, well, maybe all the points, but what it doesn't change is the slope. So we find the slope of this line using our simple rise over run formula. We find it to be 2, which means the slope of the right answer is 2, which means we're looking at answer choices C or D, but y-intercept 2 minus 6 is -4, and of course we have the right answer, and it's really not that hard. So again, less about this particular question, more about, you know, this kind of stuff with linear systems, that slope intercept stuff should be really automatic, right? If you want to be successful on this test. And then finally, this problem, which is very emblematic of the math on section 4 of the test. Those astute viewers out there might have noticed that section 3.
And before we transition over there, for one thing, I'll point out for folks who don't know this, section 3 is the section without the calculator, and section 4 is with the calculator. And for some people, this really undoes them because they want to do everything on a calculator, and which means that the section 3 without a calculator is not going to ask of us tons and tons of arithmetic, those messy numbers that Aaron mentioned. It's not designed to really skewer kids who can't do super sophisticated arithmetic without use of a calculator. What they're in fact trying to do is give us problems that look as though they need to be done with a calculator, all that math that Aaron pointed out. But if we take a half step back and say, how else can I do this? We find ways that actually don't lean on our calculator or our computational ability. There's a really good question, by the way, Aaron, in the chat about noticing a downward trend in graphing calculator usage in math classes in recent years and wondering if that's the case. Certainly one of the things I think a lot of teachers have moved towards using Desmos, which is a wonderful online program that allows people to manipulate, students and teachers to manipulate and really think more conceptually about what's going on with math. And so probably, as a result, probably a little bit less, glued to our calculator. But ultimately, I think that's probably a good thing, particularly with that problem, Aaron, you just talked about of the transition down 6 units. Ultimately, the SAT would claim to wanted to be testing kids' conceptual understanding of things, including the linear modeling, not just computation, but do kids really understand what's being asked of them when it's a concept that they should have learned presented in a novel situation? Are they able to recognize the core mathematical components thereof?
Yes, thank you for that clarification. Absolutely spot on, Ed, of course, as usual. But that conversely means that section 4 can sometimes be a little messier, right? The numbers aren't as pretty, right? You have a calculator and you might actually need it. Why? Because very often in section 4, you're dealing with questions like this. You're dealing with data questions. You're dealing with understanding information and answering questions about tables and figures and charts and graphs. Why is this? Well, the SAT is actually inspired by the Common Core standards, right? And Common Core standards specify that students should be doing more math in specific contexts. They should be doing more word problems. So the SAT, particularly section 4, is full of them. Here we reference, Henry Cavendish's famous experiment to calculate Earth-specific gravity. If you've heard about that, fabulous. I'd love to just talk all about it, but sadly, that's not what we're here for. In fact, really, the point is, you don't really need to know anything about it, right? There's a lot of background information here. Looks intimidating, lots of words. Actually, that's what we need to answer the problem. That's it, that's all. How many of his measurements are at least 5.4, but less than 5.8? Great, it's a bar graph. There you go, 5.4 to 5.8. That's 9 plus 7, that's 16. That's what you needed to do here, right? So it's easy to kind of get intimidated by, oh my goodness, specific gravity, what's that? Density, Earth, Nope, didn't need any of it. So it's great to be able to keep your wits about you, stay calm, and ask yourself, hey, what actually do I need to know to answer this question? And what honestly is just a bunch of window dressing, right? So go ahead, Ned.
Oh, I was just going to make a quick cynical aside that
please.
The College Board, when they remade the SAT in 2016, the 4th SAT that I've gotten to be part of, they added something called cross-section scores, really to try to compete with the ACT. And so they can take a math concept, just as Aaron described, throw in something that's historical, throw in something that's about science, and kind of claim that they're somehow testing history and science, when of course that's probably not true at all. A ton of thought obviously was put in by College Board when they talked about these cross-section scores, but ultimately probably no one since that initial time has put much thought into these scores at all, certainly including colleges and people making admission decisions, and certainly for all of you who are thinking about taking this test. Don't think about this, think about the math itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I encourage all my students to, the SAT score report, lots of information, but I encourage you to they're the top line scores, and then there's everything else. And, feedback is great, but when it comes to like actual admissibility, be concerned with what colleges are. That is just the top lines. They don't care about anything else. So that concludes the deep dive into questions. If I wanted to leave you with one parting thought, this is it. Can you think of anything you can practice doing yet not get better at? I'll give you a minute. It's hard, right?
Playing the lottery.
Oh, there's one in every crowd.
I stole that from a student. She's more clever than I.
There's one in every crowd. Yes,
Okay.
but really, right, this is not an intelligence test. This is not an IQ test. This is a test of acquired skills. And how does one acquire skills, Ned?
I would say practice and preparation.
I would say practice too. So again, that's the take-home message here. Whether you buy a book or see a tutor or jump in a class, right? If you care to improve, you can by practicing. And I'll leave Ned with one more final thought.
Oh yeah. So going back to I mean, certainly a bunch of content and some strategy that Aaron has talked through here. Those questions it has at the very beginning of really using the PSAT as a way to look at the test, sure, but more so to look at the test maker, the test takers. And so if I miss things because of content I've forgotten, content I haven't learned, were they kind of, unforced errors, quote unquote, silly mistakes. I really loathe the term stupid mistakes, which kids and teachers and parents can sometimes use, because it suggests that one, the kid is stupid, which I don't believe is ever the case, and two, it suggests, even if that's not the case, that somehow it's just happened, it's just out of thin air. Almost always, air quotes, stupid mistakes or silly mistakes are ones of attention, and people's attention is always someplace. This is something called the Yerkes-Dodson law. It's a performance curve, and it has to do with, across the bottom, stress, or really what's physiological arousal, and we see this going across the bottom, that if the stress is zero, typically so is the performance, right? If there's no reason, no downside, no penalty for not writing a term paper, who would ever write a term paper? Or if you play against a sports team who is just terrible, you don't have to play, you don't play your best because you don't have to. But as the stress gets higher, the arousal gets higher, we experience this as excitement and we do better, but only to a point. At some point, as the arousal increases, performance falls apart. What's important about this is that this curve is highly individualized, person to person, but also a single person in different domains. A person could really tolerate super high level, of pressure in sports or in musical performance, because that's their sweet spot. They actually do great under that, but they feel much more threatened in something other like a standardized test. And so for us as parents, as educators, we say, well, why can't you? It's no big deal. It may be no big deal to me as a dad or as a tutor. It could be a very different experience for the person taking the test. The real challenge from my perspective, the real downside about standardized tests and why they can never be truly objective, is that the individual subjective experiences of taking the test are really a big deal. So if you are, we have IECs, independent educational counselors, professionals here with us, but also interested and concerned parents. If you're trying to understand how your kid did on the test, good or bad, you want to make sure that you understand their perspective on it, not your perspective on it. Because you may be someone who really tolerates higher stress, great test taker. Your kid may be the other side. Ultimately, we're trying to get all kids to be maybe a little bit more motivated if they're not motivated enough. If they're too stressed, bringing them back to the middle so they can be at that place of optimal performance. And again, it's really highly individualized.
Yes. If only all of our students had the brains of 45-year-old lawyers like their parents.
We'd be in another job, my friend.
We would indeed. We would indeed. So that's all we have for you tonight. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Happy to stick around and answer questions. We want to make note, as Ned said, if you liked what you heard, you want to hear some more details about particularly the SAT versus the ACT, look forward a little bit. How are those tests the same? How are they different? And by the way, everything we just said for the PSAT applies pretty directly to the SAT. ACT, whole other kettle of fish. We'd love to talk to you on January 13th at 8 o'clock again about those differences, should you be interested in them.
And I would say really quickly, for a lot of kids are at schools where they've had the school has put in place a practice essay, a practice ACT, either by themselves or with a terrific local group. And so they've already been set up to make those comparisons. If you're a student or family at a school where that isn't the case, and you've taken this PSAT, the SAT, tasted the SAT, you know what it's like. Gosh, how do you go about taking an ACT? We always welcome anyone, any student to come and take an SAT with us, come and take an ACT with us. We'll grade it, we'll give it back to you. Even if you're already working with another tutor or another company, totally fine. We just want to make sure that before you really go far down the road with test prep one way or the other, that's an informed decision. Also put here in the chat, we have on our website practice tests that are available that can be done virtually. If you're far away and you're like, I'm not going all the way to Bethesda or DC or McLean, that's just not going to happen. You can always sign up for practice test here. Again, our interest is helping folks, and whether you work with us or whether this information is helpful, if we feel like we've moved the needle a little bit that way, we always feel like it was a successful use of our time. What kind of questions do folks have that we've not addressed? Oh, Aaron, you're going to jump in?
Oh, I was just going to say, someone did note in the chat that is the recording going to be available? We actually did record this thing. I believe we'll be following up with a message to registrants, probably with a link to the recording. If you don't see that, please ring our bells, either at info@PrepMatters or Ned at PrepMatters or Aaron at PrepMatters, and we'll make sure that you can access that if you'd like to watch it again or show it to some of your friends.
And one other quick point, I love Claire Law's point in there about thank goodness not having to take these tests. We will remind folks that particularly with all the goings on with COVID and a lot of individual decisions by colleges and universities, that almost everybody is fully test score optional. Some are claimed to be test score optional with a little bit of a wink and a nod, but it's very much the case that it's test score optional. And so we, even as test geeks, think that this is great. And we go back to that Yerkes-Dodson curve. It's because in a perfect world, people are in a position where they want to do things. They want to work hard. They want to work hard to take an SAT. They want to take the ACT, not they have to. Most mental health is changing thinking of I have to, which is intense and crazy making and scattered, and those executive functions that Aaron mentioned kind of go completely sideways. Changing things from I have to I want to puts us in a much better position. And I'll throw one more thing. We have had the great opportunity to write a quick piece for the Washington Post about if you're a parent and you're talking with kids, kind of what are the things we often say that might kind of miss the mark a little bit, and what might we say instead? And so I'll put this, if you've not read it, I'm very very fond of some of the advice that I've gleaned from kids and parents and what I've observed in my almost 30 years of doing this. And if you've got a kid here trying to help through this process, hopefully some of these words help you help your kid through this process.
Yeah. Well, apologies for running over by 5 minutes, but we are wont to do that. We do talk for a living, so forgive us. And we hope to see you again next month to talk a little more about the SAT and the ACT. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great night.